accomodate iniziamo.
No, guarda che devi parlare con questo, perché gli altri l'abbiamo...
Allora, buongiorno, se vi accomodate che iniziamo. Abbiamo mezz'ora di ritardo, ma era preventivato perché avevamo anche voglia di salutarci. Allora, buongiorno signore e signori, buon pomeriggio e benvenuti in Palazzo Vecchio, benvenuti nella casa comunale, benvenuti a casa vostra. Ringrazio subito i qualificati relatori di oggi che hanno fatto, credetemi, l'impossibile per essere qui e condividere con noi questa giornata, quindi grazie davvero di cuore. Porto i saluti del sindaco Nardella a tutte e a tutti voi. Saluto i rappresentanti istituzionali dei comuni di Sesto Fiorentino con il sindaco, il presidente, la presidente, poi di Siena, Gambassi Terme, Impruneta, Campi Bisenzio, gli assessori, i consiglieri comunali, i consiglieri e i presidenti di quartiere. Saluto anche i rappresentanti delle confessioni religiose presenti. E poi un abbraccio forte di sentito ringraziamento per il lavoro sul territorio delle 80 associazioni, dei partiti, dei comitati, delle fondazioni, degli enti, oltre a tanti singoli cittadini che hanno sottoscritto l'appello Pace e Giustizia in Medio Oriente e hanno chiesto al Consiglio comunale di promuovere insieme percorsi di pace per chiedere il cessate il fuoco immediato, la liberazione degli ostaggi, l'arrivo dei soccorsi umanitari e per interrompere questa assuefazione ad accettare la guerra come soluzione dei problemi. Oggi, 24 febbraio di 2 anni fa, iniziava l'offensiva dell'esercito russo in Ucraina. Alle 16 una manifestazione promossa dai cittadini ucraini che vivono a Firenze vuole ricordare questa guerra, giunta ad una fase di stallo che sembra destinata a proseguire per anni, con tutto il carico di dolore e di sofferenza che ben conosciamo. Questa mattina una bella manifestazione promossa dalla coalizione Assisi Pace Giusta e Europe for Peace per chiedere di fermare tutte le guerre, la corsa al riarmo e alla distruzione del pianeta. Purtroppo non sono andate allo stesso modo le manifestazioni di ieri organizzate in favore della Palestina. È un fatto molto grave la reazione delle forze dell'ordine verso i manifestanti, anche molto giovani. Evidentemente sproporzionata. Questo non va bene, non c'è bisogno di repressione e le immagini giunte, specialmente dalla manifestazione di Pisa, lasciano sgomenti. È bene che il governo chiarisca, così come dovrebbe chiarire le responsabilità nel mancato soccorso nel naufragio di Cutro dello scorso anno, con 94 migranti morti. «35 di questi erano piccoli, minori, piccoli bambini, una delle pagine più vergognose della nostra Repubblica. A nord e a sud dell'Europa le stesse scene raccapriccianti, uomini, donne, bambini, disperati che piangono e patiscono le pene della guerra. In Medio Oriente la pena degli ostaggi e dei familiari delle vittime uccise a sangue freddo, mutilate e violentate, le pene dei civili uccisi, bombardati, evacuati da città distrutte, diventate cumuli di macerie, fuggiti da ospedali, scuole, palazzi, senza un luogo sicuro dove andare. Tutto ciò deve o non deve scuotere la nostra coscienza? Abbiamo acquisito una volta per tutte che la guerra e i suoi perversi propositi segnano la sconfitta, ancora una volta, dell'umanità, o siamo spettatori inermi di questo progressivo squalificarsi del rispetto della vita umana? Non sono bastate 2 guerre mondiali e 70 milioni di morti per farci capire. Da quell'orrore nel 1948 è nata però la Dichiarazione universale dei diritti umani, per dire basta a tutti gli atti di barbarie e spingere l'umanità sulla via della pace. Tutti abbiamo il dovere di riconoscere agli altri gli stessi diritti fondamentali e rispettarli. I diritti umani sono i nostri diritti. Quando parliamo dei diritti umani, parliamo del diritto al cibo, all'acqua, alla salute, all'educazione, alla casa, al lavoro. Qui abbiamo anche dei compagni della GKN. Un lavoro, giustamente. Un lavoro giustamente ben retribuito e sicuro. Abbiamo diritto al riposo, al divertimento, all'ambiente, alla felicità, alla pace. I diritti umani sono la vita e la dignità di tutti. Essi costituiscono il nucleo centrale della legalità e sono la bussola politica e morale per fronteggiare la grande crisi planetaria che sta colpendo milioni di persone e che minaccia, con la drammaticità dei conflitti armati, la sopravvivenza dell'intera umanità. Sì, io credo che stiamo rischiando proprio questo. Ciascun essere umano nasce con lo stesso corredo di diritti fondamentali. Per questo si dice che i diritti umani sono innati, universali, interdipendenti ed indivisibili. La dignità umana è valore fondativo dell'ordinamento mondiale e di qualsiasi altro ordinamento ed è posta al di sopra della sovranità dei singoli Stati. Nel preambolo della dichiarazione si afferma: il riconoscimento della dignità inerente a tutti i membri della famiglia umana e dei loro diritti uguali e inalienabili costituisce il fondamento della libertà, della giustizia e della pace nel mondo. Ovviamente non tutto è un diritto. Il diritto di dire e fare quello che ci pare non esiste, come non esiste il diritto di odiare, di maltrattare, di uccidere. Il diritto di fomentare e sfruttare le paure dei più deboli, il diritto di discriminare, il diritto di respingere chi fugge dalla guerra, dalla miseria e dalle persecuzioni, il diritto di farsi strada con ogni mezzo, di pensare solo ai propri interessi, il diritto di scatenare una guerra. Sono falsi diritti che impediscono il riconoscimento dei veri diritti fondamentali e ci mettono gli uni contro gli altri. A cosa stiamo assistendo in questo periodo? Interi popoli, prigionieri della guerra, atti barbarici compiuti su persone indifese, mucchi di cadaveri, bambini mutilati, orfani, sfigurati dalla fame e dalle sofferenze, marchiati per il resto della vita. Civili uccisi, torturati, in fuga, donne violentate, città distrutte, famiglie disgregate, persone che non riescono a raggiungere gli ospedali ed essere curate, giornalisti ammazzati, volontari delle ONG uccisi, terra, aria, acqua e cibo devastati. Le più importanti conquiste sociali dell'umanità rischiano di essere cancellate. L'universalità dei diritti umani, il diritto alla dignità, il principio di uguaglianza e di giustizia, la stessa democrazia e le sue istituzioni fondamentali stanno rischiando di essere cancellate. A fianco di questi diritti parliamo ovviamente di doveri, anzi di responsabilità. Responsabilità è un termine molto più ampio di dovere. Il dovere è un obbligo, è la legalità subita. La responsabilità è la legalità agita. La responsabilità è la volontà e la capacità di agire in prima persona per l'attuazione dei principi costituzionali e universali di solidarietà, giustizia e uguaglianza. Dobbiamo fare i conti con le nostre responsabilità personali e collettive. Ciascuno ha un pizzico di responsabilità quando questi diritti sono violati. Responsabilità contro l'indifferenza, l'ipocrisia, la rassegnazione, l'appoggio a chi opera nella violazione dei diritti umani. È per questo che oggi siamo qui, per dire che stiamo dalla parte delle vittime, sempre, degli uomini e delle donne perseguitati, rapiti, cacciati, uccisi. Siamo qui per riprenderci il diritto di mettere l'umanità, la giustizia, la compassione, il perdono ai primi posti della scala dei nostri valori. Siamo qui per cercare di trovare delle risposte per il dopo la guerra, dopo la morte, dopo la paura, dopo il pianto, dopo tutto questo orrore. Questi popoli come potranno trovare un punto dal quale ricominciare? Ormai si è imposto un modello culturale che vede l'idea di noi contro gli altri, che invece dovrebbe essere il contrario, dovrebbe essere trasformato in noi e gli altri. In Israele e Palestina gli estremisti non vogliono la pace, non sono interessati al compromesso, al perdono. Loro amano la morte e non la vita. Invece, per fortuna, tante persone con coraggio stanno manifestando da entrambe le parti contro i rispettivi governi per chiedere la fine della guerra, la pace e la giustizia. Non c'è altra soluzione che la coesistenza, il rispetto e il riconoscimento reciproco. Per far ciò occorrono però leader nuovi, coraggiosi, liberi, compassionevoli. Non dobbiamo pensare la Palestina a spese di Israele e non dobbiamo pensare Israele a spese della Palestina. Se non è arrivato adesso il momento, ditemi voi quando potrà esserlo. Allora da Firenze chiediamo pace in Medio Oriente, pace in Ucraina e pace tra i popoli. Grazie.
Buongiorno a tutti e a tutte. Sono Manfredi lo Sauro e intervengo a nome delle organizzazioni riunite nella rete Pace, Giustizia e Medio Oriente. Grazie a tutti e a tutte per la partecipazione a questa conferenza, a chi ci segue in streaming e alle associazioni e alle Case del Popolo che hanno organizzato proiezioni collettive di questo incontro. Prima di cominciare, permetteteci di ringraziare il Presidente del Consiglio Comunale di Firenze, Luca Milani. Ringraziare il Presidente Milani e il suo ufficio per aver fortemente voluto questo incontro. Non era né scontato né tantomeno facile, soprattutto con questo clima che stiamo vivendo. Quindi grazie davvero. La nostra solidarietà a proposito di clima va a tutti i ragazzi e a tutte le ragazze che ieri erano in piazza a Firenze e a Pisa e hanno subito una violenza inaccettabile per uno Stato di diritto democratico. Ci preme anche ringraziare il consigliere Palazzo e le consigliere Bianchi e Bundu per il loro importante contributo. Inutile dire quanta sia l'emozione di avere relatrice e relatori di questa caratura nel cuore delle istituzioni fiorentine democratiche. Un profondo ringraziamento va anche a loro che hanno intrapreso viaggi impegnativi per essere qua con noi e che con i loro interventi sapranno aiutarci ad approfondire la conoscenza del mondo palestinese. La presente conferenza nasce dalla sottoscrizione da parte di oltre 80 organizzazioni del territorio fiorentino del documento Pace e Giustizia in Medio Oriente. Il documento è nato pochi giorni dopo il 7 di ottobre. Come abbiamo scritto nel testo, siamo inorriditi da qualsiasi violenza contro i civili, siano essi palestinesi, israeliani o di qualsiasi nazionalità. La vita non ha nazione e nemmeno la morte la deve avere. In quei giorni a Firenze alcune reazioni politiche a quanto stava accadendo in Israele e nei territori occupati palestinesi sembravano dettate più dalle emozioni che da una profonda analisi politica di contesto. Secondo noi non si teneva conto della storia della questione israelo-palestinese, che veniva ridotta a un contesto bellico post 7 ottobre, dimenticando o omettendo totalmente molti decenni di occupazione israeliana dei territori palestinesi. Come succede da decenni, si continua a concentrarsi solo sugli effetti e non ci si focalizza sulle cause. Con il nostro documento volevamo cercare di uscire dalla solita logica emergenziale con cui l'informazione e la politica italiana spesso leggono la politica estera. Con questo testo abbiamo proposto alcuni punti fermi comuni nella lettura della questione israelo-palestinese, di tutta la questione e non solo degli ultimi accadimenti. Punti fermi che per noi erano utili all'avvio di un percorso condiviso. Ovviamente questo documento è necessariamente incompleto e sicuramente perfettibile, come lo sono tutti i testi di sole 2 pagine. E molte delle oltre 80 organizzazioni firmatarie avrebbero voluto aggiungere o togliere alcuni dettagli, ma è successo qualcosa di molto prezioso. Ovvero tutte le organizzazioni che hanno sottoscritto il testo hanno fatto un passo indietro e hanno rinunciato al loro pezzettino di verità, di racconto, con l'obiettivo di raggiungere un obiettivo molto maggiore, ovvero l'unità e una base comune di lavoro. Crediamo che questo sia stato un elemento determinante e un gesto di maturità politica importantissimo. Di qui un grande grazie a tutte le organizzazioni firmatarie. Attraverso il nostro documento non ci si limita a richieste per l'immediato, evidentemente importantissime, ma si chiede un impegno a medio-lungo termine per tutte e tutti noi. Si chiede a gran forza il protagonismo delle istituzioni, in particolare quelle locali, e qui ringraziamo i molti rappresentanti istituzionali accorsi, anche in rappresentanza di consigli comunali che hanno approvato e fatto proprio il documento. Si chiede il protagonismo delle istituzioni democratiche non solo nei momenti di escalation bellica, ma anche e soprattutto quando la questione israelo-palestinese è sopita a livello mediatico, senza mai dimenticarsi che l'occupazione israeliana è presente quotidianamente nella vita del popolo palestinese. Se vogliamo, come diceva Edward Said nel 2001 citando Nelson Mandela, se vogliamo che i palestinesi e gli israeliani si riconoscano in una umanità condivisa, abbiamo il dovere di lavorarci tutti i giorni. Riconoscersi in un'umanità condivisa non è un accadimento, non è un evento, non succede grazie alla buona sorte o al buon cuore. Riconoscersi in un'umanità condivisa è un processo politico e culturale, nel quale bisogna costruire un terreno di incontro comune tra i due popoli. E questo terreno crediamo che possa essere il diritto internazionale. Il ruolo delle società europee in questo percorso è importante e quello delle istituzioni democratiche è fondamentale. Tutta la comunità internazionale ha il dovere di esigere il rispetto del diritto internazionale. Per questo si devono sostenere tutte le istanze e tutte le organizzazioni che lo promuovono e lo tutelano. Per giocare al meglio questo ruolo è importante che le nostre istituzioni e le nostre società civili aggiornino le proprie conoscenze e cerchino di comprendere in profondità il contesto in cui il conflitto si sviluppa. C'è la necessità di ricominciare a ascoltare le vittime di decenni di occupazione dei territori palestinesi, le vittime sia palestinesi che israeliane prodotte dall'occupazione, e sostenere con tutti i mezzi coloro che si impegnano nei territori occupati palestinesi e in Israele per il rispetto del diritto all'autodeterminazione dei popoli. Oggi abbiamo il privilegio e l'onore di ascoltare le nostre ospiti e i nostri ospiti. Sicuramente usciremo da questo salone con un bagaglio culturale più pesante di come ci siamo entrati e di questo siamo profondamente grati a chi interverrà. Il nostro intento è che questa conferenza possa contribuire a un rilancio dell'impegno delle istituzioni fiorentine, toscane e italiane per la soluzione della questione israelo-palestinese e per la fine dell'occupazione dei territori palestinesi. Nel passare la parola alla prima relatrice della conferenza, permetteteci un ulteriore ringraziamento, un ringraziamento personalizzato. La dottoressa Francesca Albanese è giurista e docente specializzata in diritto internazionale e diritti umani. Dal 2022 è relatrice speciale sulla situazione dei diritti umani nei territori palestinesi occupati dal 1967. Se oggi siamo qui, in questa sala, è in buona parte grazie a lei. Per questo la ringraziamo per l'aiuto, per il sostegno profuso nell'organizzazione di questa iniziativa. Ma soprattutto un grazie profondo e non retorico per il lavoro di indagine, di denuncia e di difesa dei diritti umani nei territori palestinesi che porta avanti con tenacia e dedizione tutti i giorni. Grazie mille.
Grazie mille, il vostro calore è veramente commovente. Io sono molto più abituata e mi trovo molto più a mio agio a fronteggiare i plotoni d'esecuzione che spesso incontro in Italia che tutto questo calore, ma veramente grazie. Mi perdonerete, però i commenti che volevo condividere con voi li offrirò in inglese, anche per rendere omaggio ai nostri distinti ospiti. So, distinguished guests and hosts, fellow panelists and friends, it is with great honor that I'm here today to open this conference with a few keynote remarks. To talk about peace in the Middle East, which essentially concerns the Palestinians and the Israelis, a future upon which regional peace hinges. I wish to thank Firenze's municipality and the Rete Giustizia Medio Oriente for convening such a compelling discussion with such an incredible pool of thinkers. My particular gratitude goes to the Consiglio Comunale for hosting us within this historic and magnificent sala, a setting that not only captivates and intimidates with its beauty, but also symbolizes the thriving spirit of this city, the eternal capital of Renaissance. The participation of so many of you is testament to the city's dedication to fostering an environment where peace among communities is valued, but also actively pursued, a stance which is so rare in Western institutions. So thank you for that. And on this note, I want to salute the organizers for being able to actually host this event, as the climate in Italy is not conducive at all to talk freely about Palestine or Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. Not even at a time where atrocities are being committed day after day. Not even at a time where 30,000 people have been killed in 5 months. Let us think this, 30,000 people, 13,000 kids, more than 70% of the Gaza Strip and its social fabric has been destroyed. And even now, it's difficult to talk about Israeli crimes. The question of Palestine and Israel and Palestine shakes political balances and deep-rooted biases, and often leads to silencing, censorship, and self-censoring. I'm compelled to reflect, like others before me have done, with both sorrow and indignation on the recent events in Pisa and Florence. I'm compelled to think of the young students, many of whom are minors, who had to face police brutality for simply calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. What kind of twisted world do we live in? And these incidents do illustrate the reality we navigate. where those who are entrusted with our protection meet peaceful advocacy with aggression. We know what this leads to, and this is why we should all be alerted. And yet, witnessing thousands taking on the streets only a few hours later, in solidarity with the youth, but also in protest against the institution, it's something that underscores the expectation for an unequivocal condemnation of the violence and commitment to accountability. And this brings me to the core of my message today. Palestine, I often say, represents a metaphor for persistent unresolved violence that distorts human relationships, but also international relations. Unfortunately, this violence obscures the richness that Palestinians and Israelis could enjoy if only Israel's deep-rooted apartheid were to be dismantled. First, I know that this is not because I said something intelligent, but because I uttered the word apartheid, because it is apartheid. Don't be scared to say that. South Africa gave us the word, but the reality is embodied by Israel par excellence. First, violence for the Palestinians under Israeli rule, it's physical, it's psychological, it's spatial. It's corrosive for the Palestinians who are subjected to it, but also for the Israelis who administer it. What is unraveling in Gaza now is yet another chronicle in the foretold 76-year tragedy of the Palestinian people. Just 1 week after Israel launched its brutal military campaign, I said, it's going to lead to ethnic cleansing. It has already happened. Under the fog of war, Israel forcibly displaces masses of Palestinians. It did it in 1947-49 in connection with the process that led to the creation of the State of Israel. 750,000 Palestinians were displaced amidst mass destructions of towns and cities so that they could not return. And in 1967, when Israel started the most prolonged occupation of modern history, 350,000 Palestinians were forcibly displaced amidst mass destruction of cities, towns, and refugee camps. Because meanwhile, what remained of historical Palestine had become, meaning the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, had become also land of refugees. And this is what I said, Israel is going to forcibly displace many Palestinians, and what we are watching tonight is the largest forced displacement in Palestinian histories. But what is most shocking is it's happening under our eyes, and as the South Africa legal team said to the International Court of Justice last month, this is the first genocide documented in real time by its very victims. And still, this doesn't change anything in the political reality because no action has been taken. And here it comes the second form of violence that I wanted to share with you a reflection upon today, which extends beyond physical acts. And it goes to the discursive violence that shapes perceptions of Palestine and the Palestinians. And again, the current war is an example of it. Palestinians are killed, they are blamed, and they are smeared. And this is what's happening. With 30,000 people killed, it's still their fault. They caused it because of the 7th of October. Of October. But how many 7th of October have the Palestinians endured in 100 years? And I'm not saying that to downplay. I'm not saying that to downplay the horror that Hamas and other military groups cause to the Israelis. They have committed horrific crimes against the Israelis, and I acknowledge it, and I'm in solidarity with the victims, and I call for accountability. But a crime never justifies another crime, which is what's happening. And it's happening among discursive violence. Palestinians are called animals, terrorists. Israel is justifying this war in the name of self-defense against an existential threat. Because by claiming that all the Palestinians represent an existential threat to Israel, Israel has the legitimacy to do what it's doing. And this discursive violence is amplified in Western media and Western political discourse. And this is something that we need to absolutely, urgently challenge, because it procrastinates, it perpetuates the dehumanization of the Palestinians. And Palestinians are not children of a lesser God. They also deserve protection. They also deserve rights and freedoms, along with the Israelis. So the pervasive discursive violence intertwined with the systemic denial of Palestinian suffering and the historical unaddressed injustices they have suffered for 100 years. It's something that undermines the universality of the international legal system that has been built over the ashes of the crimes that were committed during the Second World War. The last form of violence that I want to refer to, and it's the one that pierces my heart the most as a lawyer, is the double standards in the enforcement of international law. Because in these double standards, we need to be very, very clear. They are not exceptional, and they are not just circumstantial. They are in the intentional consequence of a system that is 500 years old, and it's colonialism. Colonialism, as Omar Barghouti says, 500 years of colonialism have left a huge imprint in the DNA of Western societies. And this is what we have to deal with. So it's our responsibility as Western citizens to use our privilege to undo this injustice. Because it's this... It's this which justifies the double standards. It's this which justifies the application of international law, as I often say, as a menu à la carte, pick and choose, cherry picking. No, international law is as strong as the will of states to implement it, to enforce it. But it's universal if it's universally applied, without exceptions for what we consider friends or allies. And there are a couple of examples that are especially now so tragic and so shocking. The decision of the international community, among whom our government, to defund UNRWA, based on unfounded allegations by Israel of some of its staff members being implicated in the attacks of the 7th of October. Let's imagine that it's true. These people need to be dismissed. They've already been dismissed. Without due process, they've already been terminated. So why to suspend the funds to UNRWA, which represents the only lifeline for Palestinian refugees, for Palestinians in Gaza, and also for Palestinian refugees in the region, because the cutting of funds by 18 countries, mostly Westerners, means the killing of the agency. And this is the culmination of decades of efforts led by Israel, but supported by the United States as well, to delegitimize UNRWA and to obstruct it to carry out not only its humanitarian mandate, but also to support Palestinian refugees. Because Israel somewhat thinks that by removing UNRWA, the rights of the Palestinian refugees will be extinguished, which is clearly not correct. I wrote a 600-page book on that, so I know something about that. But also, this decision encapsulates the three types of violence that I was talking about. It perpetuates the enduring anguish inflicted on the Palestinians, depriving them of food and water and medicines at the time this is critical. It also, second, reinforces the perception of the Palestinians as inferior, because with 70,000 Palestinians injured, thousands of kids left without limbs, amputated without medicines. What do we believe? Why should they be left like this without the standards of treatment that we believe other human beings deserve? And this is extremely racist. But also, ultimately, it underscores, again, the double standard that prevail in international relations, because every unsubstantiated allegations made by Israel leads to measures, while we have an interim order of the International Court of Justice, the supreme judicial organ of our international system, which says it's plausible that Israel is committing genocide and needs to do this, and this to stop, and no one follows. This is eroding the very foundation of the system that has made all of us protected. And let me conclude with one sentence. As Advocate Philip Sand told the International Court of Justice, who's also now considering the consequences of Israel's illegal occupation, he said, no one in this room is starry-eyed about international law. I mean, none of us international lawyers is naive to say, oh, international law will resolve, is the panacea for all evils. No, but this is the only peaceful tool that we have to protect ourselves and to guarantee peace and security. And this is why change will not be gifted. We will not be gifted change by our governments right now. We have to take it, because we, the people, are the ultimate guarantors of peace and stability. Thank you.
Grazie mille, grazie davvero. La prossima relatrice è la professoressa Ruba Salih, professoressa in discipline antropologiche dell'Università di Bologna, ha conseguito un PhD in Social Anthropology dall'Università del Sussex. I suoi interessi di ricerca vertono principalmente sull'antropologia politica, con particolare attenzione alle migrazioni, alle diaspore postcoloniali, rifugiati, violenza e trauma coloniale, genere, corpo e memoria. È autrice di molte pubblicazioni accademiche sulla questione dei rifugiati palestinesi. Grazie Ruba.
Well, sorry, but I'm also going to speak in English. For the same reasons that Francesca mentioned, that it's nice for us also to be able to communicate directly with our guests. I'm going to try to be speaking slowly. And like Francesca, I also wanted to really acknowledge the importance of this moment and thank the organizations and the local council for hosting this really important event. These times don't seem very favorable for freedom of speech, and so this is really something that I value very much, and so thank you very much from my heart. We are here while the carnage in Gaza reaches its 5th month. And the full scale and intensity of this genocidal devastation is not even possible to fully account for in all its dimensions. I actually would need much more than my allocated time to list the full scale of this violence. The loss of more than 30,000 human lives and twice the number in wounded, the majority children and women, the wholesale devastation and destruction of 2/3 of Gaza's habitat, the disappearance of thousands of intergenerational families, I believe 1,000 or 2,000 families entirely wiped out no trace left of them. The destruction of all the 7 universities, more than 370 schools, hospitals, health systems, all reduced to places for managing death rather than healing. Doctors, nurses, journalists, paramedics killed or executed in cold blood while on their mission to rescue, in the hundreds. Mosques and churches are not spared either, all turned into rubble. Together with anything living, whether nature or humanly, everything aimed at sustaining life is targeted. Grinding mills, water systems, electricity and fuel, solar panels. 1.8 million people are displaced and living in conditions that defining precarious is euphemistic. For the survivors, the daily task of fighting famine and disease is the only horizon of the day. Families are being affected even in their capacity to mourn their lost ones, with thousands of bodies still under the rubbles, and so many corpses abandoned without a name and a decent burial. Bearing with dignity and the right to grieve is a very basic condition of being and remaining human, from Antigone to Gaza. Cemeteries and corpses are savaged too, with appalling videos circulating over the last few weeks, showing the Israeli army, but also Israeli civilians, desecrating corpses, inciting genocidal violence even on the dead, stripping eyes, subjecting them to violent abuse and cursing at them as these bodies lie lifeless on the ground. The ferocity of this unfolding, televised genocide is so deep and horrendous that we, from our living in safe places, can't always afford to watch, and sometimes we need to distract ourselves from this evidence to remain sane. Evidence of the effects of this violence, which I repeat is televised and accessible on social media, recounted and witnessed, is there, it is abundant. Nobody will ever be able to say, I didn't know. Maybe someone in a few years, with little or no remorse, will say, I knew and I lied about it. But hey, it was with good intentions, like the Blair or the Bush who did so for the Iraqi millions who died for a lie. Today, I want to offer some reflections on how it is possible that a televised massacre of this scale, and before that, others that have taken place, one that has been defined from the outset as a textbook case of genocide, is let happen with total impunity and with increasing criminalization towards those who try to oppose it. And Francesca mentioned the youth marching peacefully in Pisa and in Florence and in other parts of the world being violently attacked and beaten up. What explanations do we have for the double standards, for the impunity of the Israeli state, for their persistent and consistent violation of international law? Let me say first that what is happening challenges the very foundation of what we are trained to believe in the West throughout all of our lives. That is, that forms of racism, violence, hatred, and impunity are the result of ignorance, of ignoring facts. It is often argued that, if they only knew, if they saw, these things will surely change. But, with more than 1,300,000 books and articles written on the topic of Palestine and Palestinian Israeli conflict, it may be more honest to say that it's not the lack of information that is triggering this reality. Facts are consciously and actively either obscured or ignored. Palestinian lives are ignored. The sheer dehumanization of Palestinians has never been so crystal clear, but I will come back to that. Let me say also, however, that this 100-year-long conflict is part and parcel. It is an emanation, in fact, or a continuation of an unresolved European history and politics. Europeans can and must do all they can to stop this violence, this genocide, as they have a direct historical and moral responsibility for the plight of the Palestinian people. Today, silence means not only complicity, but it also means that very little was learned from history, and that one form of historical racism, anti-Semitism, is substituted with a new one, anti-Palestinianism. For me personally, as a Palestinian and daughter of Palestinians who lost their home twice in 1948, when they were just kids, and then in 1967, when they were students in Europe and were cut off forcibly from their homes and families, losing their right to return and to live in Palestine forever, the current situation calls into question really the very possibility of a detached and cold analysis. In this sense, I ask you to bear with me while I claim this as a highly emotional and painful moment. As a Palestinian brought up in Europe in a life marked by this deep and profound loss, but also with the privilege of not living under occupation, and as an academic, I always felt a certain degree of responsibility, a moral, ethical, and political responsibility to speak about Palestine, about my people. And yet, this has never been more cogent and dramatically urgent for me as during these months. Not only in the common sense that we think about responsibility, but in a more visceral, personal way, no less political though. As I'm speaking to you today, I'm thinking about what my father, for instance, who was born in Haifa and recently passed away and was buried in exile under an olive tree and with a kufiya on his coffin in Italy, would feel and would want me to say. Or my mother, who was born in the outskirts of Jaffa and wrote her memoir over 30 years ago while on a deathbed in the wake of the Oslo Accords before passing away, and died thinking that her home and her people were about to see peace and self-determination after decades of occupation, exile, and dispossession. But I'm also carrying with me the words that reached us from Gaza over the last months, the voices of journalists, community workers, feminist organizers, fathers, mothers, students, who in the messages that they managed to send us continued asking, is this real? Are we in a nightmare? As they tell us of the inhuman choices they had to make, such as deciding who to rescue from under the rubbles, based on who has more possibility to survive, or the everyday struggle to find water and food for the children, risking their life venturing outside and risking their life staying inside. Where is the world? How can this be let happen? We heard. One text message sent in October said, "We went to sleep in 2023 and we woke up in 1948. These voices speak the unspeakable trauma of genocide and must reverberate in our daily lives, in our workplaces, as they do in this room now. But let me say that the notion of trauma is really insufficient for explaining the full scale of the violence that Palestinians have been subjected to. This current cycle of violence is being enacted on a people that has been multiple times wounded and violated. In 48, in 67, in 1982. In Gaza, the bombings of 2008, 2012, 2016, 2018, 2022. Without mentioning the everyday forms of humiliations of a life unfolding through checkpoints, separation walls, settlers' violence, and full siege and imprisonment for Gaza prior to October the 7th. Primo Levi, in his The Drowned and the Saved, said that trauma can only be apprehended once a framework, a canvas exists that can give meaning to the experiences, or, as he does, to use the metaphor of the illness, once recovery is completed. It is clear that for Palestinians, there has never been an ending. What we have is ongoing and repeated violence, occupation and apartheid, a historical injustice that has not been recognized nor repaired, and which acquired unbelievable magnitude today with the genocidal violence that Israel is inflicting on Gaza. Going back to Europe and to the here and now, all of us who carry the possibility, have responsibility of trying to reverse the invisibility of the Palestinians and of their suffering. It is indeed never been as crystal clear as it is today that there is an asymmetry of value attributed to Israeli and Palestinian lives in this part of the world. So let me move to the second part of this talk, the dehumanization of the Palestinian people. It is nothing new for oppressed and colonized people to be subjected to othering, silencing, and selective visibility in which they are made to appear only within certain perceptual views, terrorists, violent protesters, murderers, or humanitarian subjects, and to be absented from their most human qualities. But the weeks after October 7th have set a new bar in terms of the inverted and perverse ways that Palestinians are discussed. The idea that 7th of October marks the beginning of unprecedented violence, as the media continue to propose, captures the experience of one side, the Israeli, while totally obliterating the past decades of Palestinian lives under occupation and siege. Today, post-October 7th, even the acts of contextualizing and providing a historical frame are blamed as morally reprehensible. For some countries and for some institutions, even to mention that Gaza was under siege since 2008 and is occupied territory for international law is considered straight-out anti-Semitism. What is more, Palestinian lives continue to be intelligible only through the lens of Israeli sensibility and subjectivity. Palestinians exist either to protect Israel or to destroy Israel. Outside these two assigned representations, they simply are not, and they must not be. What is more is the persistent denying by Israel, despite the abundant historical evidence, that Palestinian indigenous presence in Palestine has always been, since the outset, at best a problem to manage or to contain. At worst, the object of systemic and persistent ethnic cleansing and erasure, aiming at fulfilling a narcissistic image of a land without a people for a people without a land, as the famous slogan has it. Violence on Palestinians, even today in Gaza, is affected and denied at one and the same time, with the historical victims represented as the offenders. In psychoanalytic terms, there is a name for this kind of rhetoric and dynamic. It is gaslighting. Dismissing Palestinian lived experience of colonialism, siege, and apartheid as invalid, propaganda, hate speech, immoral, outrageous, and even, for some countries, contrary to liberal values, is the first stage of this gaslighting rhetoric. The second stage is to reverse victim and offender, which Israel does in response to demands to face responsibilities for the current cycle of violence. Indeed, Israel continues claiming that everything and everyone, from the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, to the UN, to Amnesty International, to Human Rights Watch, to countries of the entire global South, starting from the brave South Africa, to anyone bringing or bearing evidence or bearing witness to the predicament of Palestinians, or even marching for a ceasefire, is blamed as the attacker and as the offender. Even merely to argue that there is a context in which events took place, such as General UN Director Guterres did when he stated that October 7th did not happen in a vacuum, is represented as inciting terrorism or as morally repugnant hate speech. In the few media reports accounting for the dire and deprived condition Palestinians live through in Gaza, the reasons causing these conditions are hardly mentioned. For instance, we hear in reports that Palestinians in Gaza are mostly refugees, that they are unemployed, and that 80% of them were relying on aid, with trucks of humanitarian aid deemed insufficient today in comparison to the number of trucks that were let in previous October the 7th. But astoundingly, the 56 years 17-year-old Israeli occupation and 17-year-old siege as root causes for the destruction of the economy, of unemployment, of reliance on aid are not mentioned, so that the public is left to imagine that these calamities are outcomes resulting from Palestinians' own doing. But perhaps one of the most disconcerting forms of gaslighting is the demand that Palestinians should and could suspend their physical and psychic injury to center Israeli feelings and grief as their own. In fact, for months, the issue of grief has come to global attention almost exclusively as an ethical and moral question in reaction to the loss of Israeli lives. Palestinians who speak publicly, and even not only Palestinians, are constantly asked whether they condemn the loss of Israeli lives, before and above they can even dare talking about their own long history of loss and dispossession. And literally, in some cases, while their families are being annihilated under the carpet bombing of their homes or in the streets while fleeing in search of refuge. To put it in another way, would it even be conceivable to imagine a journalist asking one of the Israeli hostages in captivity if they condemn the Israeli bombardments and the war on Gaza as a precondition to speak or to be freed? The paradox here is that Palestinians are expected to prove they share the universal idea that all human life is sacred, at the same time as their own humanity and the sacrality of their life is violently precluded to them, and when they are experiencing with brutal clarity that their existence as a people matters to no one who has the power to stop this carnage. So the depth of this dehumanization is expressed with lucid clarity by Israeli President Herzog, who declared that there are no innocents in Gaza. And I quote, "It's an entire nation out there that is responsible." This rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved, it's absolutely not true. They could have risen up. They could have fought against the evil regime, end of quote. Ofer Haddad, journalist and TV anchor, Israeli, wrote, and I quote, "The world finally understands who the animals we are dealing with are. This allows the IDF to exact a much heavier price from Gaza, not only from Hamas." If this was not clear enough, The Guardian, the newspaper Guardian, the British newspaper Guardian, and the Plus 972 local call magazine have provided chilling evidence that Palestinian civilians are not even collateral damage, but are directly targeted through a sophisticated artificial intelligence system that generates hundreds of unverified targets with the aim of eliminating as many civilians as possible. And yet, the thousands killed, nearly half of them children, are framed as Palestinians' own doing. Palestinians are deemed responsible for their own devastating deaths, for not fighting Hamas to protect Israelis from their role, from within their role as occupied people. It appears then that whether Palestinians deserve to live or to die depends on whether they accept or not to remain colonized. Any attempt to struggle against this injustice historically has been met with violence, whether it was civil disobedience, campaigns such as the Boycott and Divest movement, peaceful marches, hunger strikes, popular committees resisting settler attacks, cultural productions, even poetry. All these modes of trying to exit their condition as colonized and to fight the historical injustice has consigned Palestinians to a position of trans-historical evilness, of terror. It seems then that no matter what Palestinians do, they keep being dehumanized so that Israel can have confirmation that they're not human and continue in its politics of erasing them unabated. Why one might be compelled, and I'm sure many do, and understandably so, believe that this dehumanization is, and the war on Gaza today, is a reaction to the legitimate pain and sorrow and shock generated by the traumatic and emotional aftermath of October the 7th attack on Israeli civilians. But however, history doesn't agree with this. The idea of Palestinians as a human community, as a people seeking self-determination, has never had a place in the perceptual prism of most of Israeli society. The humane standpoint of a people seeking self-determination and freedom from occupation and siege has consistently been reversed and catalogued as one of terrorism towards Israeli society, or an impediment to the Israeli expansive plan, whether the latter are seen and represented as divinely mandated or backed by a secular imaginary. And this is also true for the right of return of Palestinian refugees, which I was asked to touch upon. A right enshrined in UN resolutions, and most importantly, enshrined in 75 years of waiting for justice for the now more than 7 million refugees and their descendants. Hundreds of thousands still living in refugee camps, now cities, and in some cases still rightless and in dire conditions in camps such as Shatila or Burj al-Barajni in Lebanon or Gaza camp in Jordan. This is another instance where the historical victim is represented as the aggressor. In Israeli and some Western narratives, and I wanted to remind us that 2/3 of Gazans are refugees from 1948 who can still see their ancestral homes and villages from beyond the wall. So in Israeli and some Western narratives, the right to return, which note is different from the actual willingness or likelihood of return of all refugees and their descendants. We're talking about the right of return is discarded as equivalent to the destruction of the state of Israel. No responsibility, no reparation, no compensation is in sight for the refugees who are now seen as part of the problem rather than of the solution. Surely this can't be right. We were saying that dehumanization of Palestinians goes back in history. And I wanted to remind you that back in 2021, Israeli lawmaker Ayelet Shaked stated, "Terrorists are birthed by snakes and wild beasts and must be exterminated." And her words bear citation as they anticipate Gaza's current devastation with lucid clarity. And I quote, "Behind every terrorist stand dozens of men and women without whom he could not engage in terrorism. They are all enemy combatants, and their blood shall be on their heads." Urging the killing, end of quote, urging the killing of all Palestinians, women, men, and children, and the destructions of their homes, she continued, and I quote, "They should go, as should the physical homes in which they raised their snakes. Otherwise, more little snakes will be raised there. They have to die, and their houses should be demolished so that they cannot bear any more terrorists." End of quote. This is not an isolated case. Back in 2016, Prime Minister Netanyahu argued that fences and walls should be built all around Israel to defend it from wild beasts. And it is against this long-term historical dehumanization that a month ago, retired Israeli general and former head of intelligence Giora Eiland can augur that all Palestinians in Gaza die of fast-spreading disease and all infrastructure be destroyed, and still claim the higher moral standard for Israel. So I conclude. Locating events within the context of the incommensurable historical injustice inflicted upon the Palestinians since 1948, which have assumed a new magnitude with the current war on Gaza, is not just ethically urgent, but also politically imperative. We are desperately in need of reorienting the world's moral compass by taking stock of the intertwined processes of humanization and dehumanization of Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. There is no other way to exit the conditions that usher violence, mass killings, and genocides, and towards a way of effecting the ideal, so far only ideal, notion that lives have or must have equal value. This is the precondition to make sure that the seeds for a just and durable peace be planted and that Israeli Jews and Palestinians can live together in a newly defined humanity. Thank you.
Grazie alla professoressa Saleh. Ora è il turno del dottor Mustafa Barghouti, medico e presidente della ONG Union of Palestinian Medical Relief Committees, già candidato alla presidenza dell'Autorità Nazionale Palestinese nel 2005. Nel 2010 è stato candidato al Premio Nobel per la Pace. Attualmente è membro del Consiglio legislativo palestinese e membro del Consiglio centrale dell'Organizzazione per la Liberazione della Palestina. Grazie, dottor Barghouti.
Thank you. I'm proud to be here with you in Florence, the wonderful city, in this very important historic place. And I want to start by thanking the municipality and the head of the municipality for hosting us today. Thank you so much. And thank you for the great speech you made about the rights of the Palestinian people. I thank you all for being so concerned with the Palestinian rights and for your solidarity with our people. What we face today is an unprecedented war. What we face today is the worst man-made human crisis. What we face today is Israel conducting 3 war crimes in parallel. The war crime of collective punishment, the war crime of genocide, and the war crime of ethnic cleansing, imposing a terrible siege on Gaza, trying to dehumanize every Palestinian, conducting terrible acts of collective punishment against a whole population. In 4 months, they've killed 37,000 people, including no less than 12,000 children, 9,000 women, and injured no less than 70,000, many of whom will die because there is no treatment for them since Israel destroyed most of the medical infrastructure. I am a medical doctor, and I never thought in my life that in the 21st centuries, my colleagues will call me and say they had to amputate on a person without anesthesia, or that they had to operate on a child without anesthesia. Mr. Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, who is now on the blacklist of Israel, besides many people, like you, Francesca, said that in the 2nd month of the war, he said that the number of Palestinian children killed in Gaza is larger than all children killed in all wars in all over the world in the last 3 years. But the number keeps growing. It's more than that. If we count the number of Palestinians killed and injured, it's more than 4.5% of the population of Gaza, which, if it has happened in the United States of America, you will be talking about 12 million people killed or injured in 4 months. As a matter of fact, the number of Palestinians killed in Gaza in 4 months is larger than all Americans killed in all American wars since the 18th century, proportionally. They've destroyed 70% of the homes of people. They've destroyed all universities. They've destroyed most of the schools. They destroyed 31 out of 36 hospitals. They destroyed the networks of electricity, water, sewage systems. Is that an act of civilization? 69,000 tons of explosives were thrown on Gaza in 4 months. That is much larger than both nuclear bombs that were used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the Second World War. It's 28 kilograms of explosives for each man, woman, or child in Gaza. And the siege is creating hunger and starvation. According to the World Food Programme, 700,000 Palestinians now are starving, especially in the north of Gaza. 2 days ago, we had a report that in 10 days, Israel allowed only 9 trucks. In 10 days, only 9 trucks, while Gaza needs 1,000 trucks of supplies every day. And the President of the United States of America and Mr. Blinken and all the other European politicians have the guts to stand up and say we are encouraging humanitarian aid. 9 trucks in 10 days for 2.3 million people. Because of this siege and this destruction of infrastructure, we have now 700,000 sick people, diseased. Some of them with outbreaks of infections like hepatitis. 10,000 people have now infectious hepatitis. 70,000 have scabies, a skin disease. More than 150,000 have gastroenteric infections. 86,000 of them are children. 50,000 pregnant women do not have a safe place to give birth in. And 64,000 breastfeeding women do not have milk, do not have food, do not have supplies to help their children. I receive continuously calls from Gaza, from families, because we have 30 medical teams working there for Palestinian Medical Relief Society, and they work in the north, in Gaza, and in the south. I receive phone calls from people begging to find a way of provision of treatment for 10,000 patients with cancer who have no treatment whatsoever. And not only that, even our medical teams are subjected to attacks. Up till this moment, we've lost 346 of our medical colleagues, doctors, nurses, health professionals, ambulance drivers. 300 others were injured. But the worst, 99 were arrested and are being tortured in Israeli concentration camps. I'll tell you the story because sometimes stories are better than tens of speeches. One of our ambulance drivers, his name is Walid, was caught near our center, which was bombarded by tanks. He was treating an injured person with another doctor, and when they got out of the house, the snipers saw them and they shot the doctor in the abdomen. He fell down. Our guy tried to help him, but the sniper shot the doctor again in the head and killed him. And this guy had to hide in a nearby house, and he called us and said, I had 7 people with me, and they were all shot. I think I will be killed, so please take care of my children. And then he disappeared for 3 weeks. After 3 weeks, he came back with broken ribs, with bruises all over his body, and he told us horrifying stories about how he was kidnapped by the Israeli army and taken to a concentration camp in the Negev near Beersheba, where he and 1,000 others were kept and tortured with electrical shocks, with beating, with drowning them in the water, same things that were used in Guantanamo and in Abu Ghraib in Iraq, and that's why people call this concentration camp the new Guantanamo. The director of Shifa Hospital, which is the largest hospital in Gaza, in Palestine actually, was arrested, and he's still arrested. They broke both of his arms and both of his legs. They forced him to creep like a dog on 4, and they keep torturing him because he refuses to record a video claiming that he was helping Hamas. This is the kind of treatment that Palestinians are subjected to. Hind, a young girl, 6 years old. She was in a car with 6 members of her family. The tanks saw them. They bombarded the car, and 5 of her family members were killed. Her sister called the ambulance asking for help. Then her sister was shot and killed. And this little girl, Hind, for hours, cried and begged for help. It's all on record. She was calling Red Crescent, asking for an ambulance. And the girl who was answering the phone was trying to calm her for hours. They sent an ambulance, and then they disappeared. After 10 days, her body was found, and the ambulance driver and the nurse were killed as well, and the ambulance was completely destroyed. Tell me, what's the difference here between Hind and Anna Frank? What's the difference? Tell me, what's the difference between Anna Frank and that little boy who's one of 1,000 Palestinian children who had amputations of their hands and legs? What's the difference between Anna Frank and that little boy who lost both of his hands and broke my heart when I saw his video telling his father, "Father, will my hands grow up again when I grow up?" What's the difference? Anna Frank was a human being that suffered because of Nazi oppression, and these kids are the same human beings that are suffering from the same behavior of fascist Israeli army. And Israel can declare Lula da Silva as persona non grata in Israel, but what does he care? Who cares about that? Just because he told the truth that I'm telling you today. It's not just the Gaza Strip. West Bank also, although the difference is huge, is suffering today from terrible oppression. Since the 7th of October, 400 Palestinians were killed. 20 of them were killed by Israeli terror settlers. Villages were attacked, houses were burned. The whole West Bank is cut in 224 small ghettos by 654 military Israeli checkpoints, many of which are closed continuously. And the settlements go on, and the oppression and terror goes on, and the Israeli army has re-invaded every city already in the West Bank, practically reoccupying all of the West Bank, and making the Palestinian Authority an authority without authority under occupation. United States of America, United Kingdom, are not only complicit in this war and these crimes, they are participating in it. Because the United States sent 2,000 troops to participate with the Israeli army and sent their advisors to help them. And Israel and American and British planes continuously fly over Gaza, helping the Israeli army. The air bridge that is supplying Israel with weapons is unprecedented in the history of the Middle East, providing the same bombs that killed thousands of people in Gaza. And most important, they adopted all the lies that Netanyahu said. You remember the lies about decapitation of children, about burning children, about rape of women. I don't know how Mr. Biden lost all respect to his position and to himself by repeating the lies that Netanyahu said and that American media itself revoked later. But as was said before, this happened before, justifying the war on Iraq. But unfortunately, nobody can bring back the million Iraqis that were killed in that war, as much as nobody can bring back the 37,000 Palestinians who were killed so far. And that's why it's our duty today, your duty, our duty, the duty of all humanity to stop these massacres and stop this war immediately. The message that is sent to the world is very dangerous. The message that the United States of America obstructing each time a ceasefire resolution at the Security Council, the message they are sending to the world is very dangerous. It is that we, the people of this world, do not live by international law anymore. We live by the law of jungle. And you know what consequences can be related to that. The message is that there is double standard. Today, all the Western leaders are in pilgrimage to Kiev, to Ukraine, because they say there is an occupation there. And then they had a pilgrimage to Israel, which is the occupying power. Where is the international law here? Where is it? As a matter of fact, Netanyahu mobilized all the bad behavior and all the bad ideologies of this world. The white supremacy, the racism, the fascism, the Islamophobia, the hate to refugees. The closest allies to Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben Gvir, the fascists today, are the same Nazis that conducted the worst anti-Semitism against Jewish people. And I said it on TV several times that the biggest provocator of anti-Semitism today is Benjamin Netanyahu. And here in Europe, I would like to say, and I hope that our German friends will hear us, that the same mindset that allowed Holocaust against Jewish people because they thought they were weak, the same mindset that allowed anti-Semitism against Jewish people in Europe is the same mindset is allowing this Holocaust against Palestinian people. What happened on the 7th of October did not come out from the blue. It was a result, and I don't justify killing any civilian. Of course, I'm against that. Whoever is the civilian is, Palestinian, Israeli, American, whoever he is or she is. But nobody should forget that we've been subjected to ethnic cleansing for 75 years. And Palestinians have not been helped to get over this terrible ethnic cleansing. We've been subjected to 57 years of military occupation, which has become the longest occupation in modern history. And we are subjected today to the worst system of apartheid, a much worse apartheid than what prevailed in South Africa at one point in time. And we are the victims of settler colonial system that continues to expand by building settlements in the occupied territories in Palestine. This is the reality, and this is what's happening. Before October 7th took place, Israel was expanding settlements in the occupied territories at an unprecedented rate. Before October 7th happened, Netanyahu was declaring all over the world that he is liquidating the Palestinian issue through normalization with Arab countries and that there is no Palestinian question anymore. Before October 7th, 2 weeks before October 7th, he stood up in the General Assembly of the United Nations and held the new map of the Middle East, which he said this will be the map of the coming 50 years, showing all the Arab countries that he normalized or wants to normalize with in green, and Israel in blue in the heart of that map. Israel that annexes all of the West Bank, all of the Golan Heights, and all of Gaza Strip. The same Gaza Strip that the Israeli propaganda was saying they have withdrawn from. That is the reality. And we know, of course, also that he had in his pocket the plan to start assassinating Palestinian leaders. In reality, this is the reason why we see what's happening today. In reality, and I will add one more point, although it's besides the point, we would not have had this war if Palestinians were allowed in 2021 to have their free democratic elections, which we were supposed to have. But Israel was against it, United States was against it, many other countries were against it. Why? Why the United States of America, which advocates democracy when it comes to Serbia, when it comes to China, but for Palestinians, there should be no democracy. And we should not be allowed to have democratic free elections. What we face today is a dangerous situation because what we see is not only racism and occupation and apartheid. What we see today is the growth of fascism in Israel. And a fascism that is affecting the whole establishment. And the proof to that is the passage of the nation-state law in Israel, which happened a few years even before what we see today, which says that the right of self-determination in what they call Eretz Israel, which is the whole of historic Palestine, is exclusive for Jewish people. But we are 7 million Palestinians on this land versus 7 million Jewish people. So if they don't want two-state solution, and they don't want one democratic state solution, which I want very much, with equal rights for everybody, then what is the solution? Their solution is what they do now, ethnic cleansing and genocide. That's exactly what they are trying to do. And most recent vote in the Israeli Knesset, this gives you an idea about Israel today. 99 members of the Israeli parliament out of 110 Jewish members, because there are 10 Arabs which we exclude from this count, 99 out of 110 voted against any Palestinian state and against any recognition of a Palestinian state. 68% support a continuation of the war and an attack on Rafah, which could cause the worst kind of massacre in modern history. And that is the plan that Netanyahu still holds. He wants to liquidate the Palestinian issue. His plan that he just declared is about liquidation of Palestinian rights, Palestinian nationality, even liquidation of all UN agencies that support the humanitarian needs of Palestinians, and especially UNRWA. Why this attack on UNRWA? Because it's the only organization that can sustain humanitarian assistance now in Gaza, and more important, because UNRWA represents the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 194, which speaks about the right of return for Palestinian refugees. And by the way, the recognition of Israel by the UN was conditioned with the implementation of two resolutions, 181, which speaks about the Palestinian state, and 194, which says that Israel must allow all refugees to come back home. That's the United Nations decision, which was a condition for recognition of Israel. He wants to kill UNRWA because he wants to kill the right of the Palestinian people. They are attacking everybody. They are attacking United Nations. They are attacking Palestinian NGOs. They are suffocating even the Palestinian Authority. They are going after human rights organizations. And all they want is to consolidate occupation and oppression and ethnic cleansing. And that's why I say today Israel is a pariah state. And that means there should be response to that. And that's why I'm calling on you to continue your support and solidarity, which we appreciate very much, but with specific goals. The first one is immediate, permanent ceasefire to prevent another massacre now in Rafah, to prevent the possibility of ethnic cleansing. Second, to encourage all governments that keep talking about Palestinian state and two-state solution, but don't have the guts to recognize Palestine. Let them recognize Palestine if they were serious, and let them say that Palestine means end of occupation. Palestine means end of settlement activities. And Palestine means removal of Israeli settlements from the occupied territories. Without saying these things, I don't believe what they say about two-state solution. It's just a lip service to cover up for the normalization with what remains of the Arab countries. Third, encourage the negotiations that are happening now for exchange of prisoners. I want the 134 Israeli prisoners to come home safe. But I also want the 8,000 Palestinian prisoners to be released, including some people like Ilan Pappé, who has been in jail for 42 years. And finally, what I call on you, if you want your solidarity to be effective and meaningful, please support boycott, divestment, sanctions against Israel. Till Israel ends the occupation, the apartheid, stops the war, and stops these fascists from ruling this country. Some Israelis think, and some people think, that the people's opinion doesn't matter. And the governments will continue to do what they do, including your government, of course. And the people's opinion doesn't matter. I say this is wrong. Your opinion matters. Your actions matter. And as a matter of fact, the people's movement during the last few months have changed the policies of many governments. So believe in yourself and believe in your solidarity and believe in your ability to pressure your own government to change their line. Two last things. There is a fantastic Palestinian poet who was also a mayor. He was the mayor of Nazareth. And he got, I don't know what percentage you got in elections, but that guy got about 70% in the elections he had. And that poet, his name was Tawfiq Zayad. He said something very, very right, which I like to repeat frequently. He said, we, the Palestinian people, are not better than any other people in this world. But no other people in this world are better than us. And we should be treated equally. We should be treated as equal human beings. You cannot humanize some people and dehumanize other people. That is not acceptable. Mandela once said, Nelson Mandela said, that the issue of Palestine is the most moral issue of our time. And I think this time it's more important to remember that than any time before. And I promise you, nothing as Palestinians, nothing will break us. Nothing will stop us from struggling for our rights. Nothing will stop us from believing in our rights. We will never surrender, and we will achieve our freedom. We will achieve what we want, because there is no power in this world that can stop people who are determined to be free and to get their freedom. And I assure you, as many friends here know, as many of you who have been with us in Palestine and have experienced not only the suffering we have, but we're also beaten like us, like Luisa Morgantini, who was beaten with me in the same demonstration. I say to all of you, what you do is great. What you do will help us a lot. And be assured, one day, with your solidarity and with your support, we will overcome. We will overcome regardless of what they do. Thank you so much.
Grazie davvero al dottor Mustafa Barghouti. Ora è il momento di un collegamento. Con noi c'è la dottoressa Sarit Michaeli, responsabile dell'International Advocacy di B'Tselem. B'Tselem è un'organizzazione non governativa israeliana che ha l'obiettivo di documentare ed educare il pubblico e i politici israeliani sulle violazioni dei diritti umani compiuti dallo Stato di Israele nei territori occupati. Quindi passiamo la parola a lei e la ringraziamo di essere qui con noi. Grazie.
Thank you to everyone. I assume you hear me. First of all, I'd like to say thank you and how much I appreciate this opportunity to speak, even though it's from afar, not being with you. But unfortunately, there's just too much that kept me here. Secondly, maybe in the time that I have, I would like to share a few aspects, not an exhaustive description, but a few aspects of the experiences that we have been having as an Israeli organization that has both Israeli, Jewish, and Palestinian staffers in our staff and among our kind of like group of colleagues in the last few months. And what this means and what we have been doing also to try and present a different voice, a voice that rejects some of the most central and I think the most broadly accepted positions currently in Israeli society. Things haven't started on October 7th. Certainly, a lot of B'Tselem has been, the organization I work for, has been around since 1989, documenting the whole range of human rights violations inherent to the Israeli occupation. But I do want to start on October 7th to describe a little bit what it means to be us at the moment, and then to move on to what we've done. I think we're some of the quite rare group of Israelis who have been experiencing viscerally, personally, the horrors that have been inflicted on our region, the horrors that human beings in our region are suffering. We've been experiencing it from both directions. On October 7th, are the group or some of the most affected groups that were hurt, that were devastated by the atrocious, the horrific attack by Hamas on Israeli civilians were actually members of our broad community. People living in the southern part of Israel, people involved, many of them in the human rights community. And we also personally experienced a terrible loss. A former member of our board was killed, Vivian Silver, in the Be'eri kibbutz. Another chair of our board lost an uncle and also had a relative, his aunt, abducted, kidnapped into Gaza. And we have many friends and partners who lost loved ones who were deeply affected by October 7th. And then almost immediately, as we were understanding, as we were making sense of what was going on in the south of Israel, this horrific attack, we were also beginning to receive information from our Gaza-based field researchers on what they were going through. We have three colleagues, three staffers in Gaza, who since October 7th have basically been dealing with the exact same reality that all other people in Gaza are experiencing. The fact that they're human rights defenders, the fact that they are deeply committed to this shared project of ours means nothing. Two of them have actually lost their homes, have been displaced, and their homes have been bombed. One spent a few weeks with her family living in a tent in an IDP encampment. And one is still has his home because his home is in Rafah, which has currently become, as we all just heard, one of the largest concentrations of displaced Palestinians, and where the residents are daily living in fear of an ongoing incursion. Additionally, two of my colleagues lost dozens of family members killed in Israeli bombings. And this is, I think, quite a rare experience, to experience loss, to mourn, to share the grief of people on both, both sides of the border between Israel and Gaza. And it has enabled us to put forward in our own society a very strong moral call, which unfortunately, I think it isn't going to be a surprise. Unfortunately, it is not heard by many Israelis at the moment. A call to avoid revenge, a very, very strong demand to protect civilians, an unequivocal statement that the horrors that were inflicted on Israelis do not justify in any way the horrors that we are inflicting on Gazans in our indiscriminate bombing campaign on Gaza, which B'Tselem has described as a war crime. We've been analyzing the situation in Gaza, just like all other human rights groups, trying to make some sense of what's going on, trying to understand and assess the situation there. But it's been extremely difficult because the basic tools that we have to operate, that are field research, that are testimonials, that are listening to victims and witnesses and taking testimonies and gathering information, are simply impossible currently in Gaza. So the majority of our work has been on analyzing publicly available information, criticizing, looking into the Israeli policies as they're expressed in both official statements and also on the situation on the ground, and referring to them. This is unfortunate because the most important thing I think that B'Tselem has always done when it comes to the Gaza Strip has been to bring the voices of people on the ground to our audiences. And this is going to continue. And I think the work that we have done together with colleagues in other organizations in the Israeli human rights community has culminated in our own call for a ceasefire, which was made, I think, partly as a result of the inaction of the international community, the inability of the international community to make good on its rhetoric of the obligation to protect civilians, the obligation to adhere to international humanitarian law. We've seen again and again international visitors coming, international leaders coming to Israel and relating to Israeli policymakers this seemingly hypothetical requirement to adhere to international law and to avoid targeting civilians, when it is abundantly clear, and it became clear in the early moments of the Israeli attack on Gaza, that Israel has no intention to adhere to international law and has operated in a way that is in grave breach of these provisions. Yet still the international community is continuing to raise the need to protect civilians. And this is one of the reasons that has led us to a call for a ceasefire, because clearly there is just simply no way to protect civilians currently, and there is no way to avert the humanitarian, or it's not to avert because the humanitarian catastrophe is with us, but to try and move towards a slightly less catastrophic culmination of what we are seeing on the ground, both in southern Gaza and in northern Gaza, of people starving, of the total breakdown of any sort of public order, of the inability to get any sort of health provisions, all of this as clearly predicted by the humanitarian community. All of this has led us, and then together with another 30 other Israeli and Israel-based civil society groups to call for a ceasefire that will include a hostage swap. Unfortunately, currently there is the prevailing wind in our own society is very much removed from this call, but we will continue to make our voices heard, and we'll try and do as much as we can to continue to raise this very basic demand. I'd like to move also to describe the reality currently in the West Bank, because I think it's deeply connected to what we're seeing in Gaza. And again, we don't have a lot of time, so it'll have to involve like a small sample of issues. But I think on a very fundamental level, the events of October 7th have been a golden opportunity for the Israeli settler movement, the Israeli government, the Israeli establishment to continue to work towards achieving objectives that have been their objectives since long before October 7th. But the Israeli public climate, the fact that all media and all focus is on the events in Gaza, the fact that there is a lot of anger and hatred and a wish for revenge within the Israeli public has enabled the turbocharging of processes of forcible transfer, of removing Palestinian communities from their homes, primarily in the rural areas of the West Bank, to an extent that has not been seen before. And this is something that we have been documenting on an ongoing basis, because I think it's very clear that the existence of these Palestinian communities, they're primarily herding communities that live a very simple but dignified life, grazing sheep and cows on their land. The basic existence of these communities is now threatened, and I'd like to share the map of these communities that have been forcibly transferred since October 7th and beforehand, and I hope you can see it just briefly. This is a map of the West Bank, and the communities that have been forcibly transferred before October 7th are marked in yellow, but since then the red dots all mark communities that have been fully displaced through the combined use of violence and threats, and also through the operation, the actions of the Israeli security forces. So this is a forcible transfer that has been perpetrated by settlers with the absolute support and sometimes the clear involvement of the Israeli security forces. And in fact, since October 7th, the line between settlers, civilians, Israeli civilians living in the West Bank, and members of the security forces has been completely blurred. People throughout the West Bank report that since October 7th, they've been seeing the same settlers who have been tormenting them as civilians, now wearing military uniform and continuing this ill treatment, this harassment, and in some cases, the use of extreme violence. And I think the main thing you see when you look at this map, at the scope, at the concentration, and the geographic location of all of these areas, you see a very clear plan to target all the open spaces throughout the West Bank. Those are spaces that are primarily used by herding communities, by relatively small communities of Palestinians who are an essential component also of the economy and of the culture and of the population of the large population centers throughout the West Bank. But very clearly, this violence that is, as I said, ongoing, and it happens in broad daylight and with the express permission and support of the authorities, is geared at least at the first step, pushing Palestinians away from all the open land throughout the West Bank into these densely populated Bantustans where the rest of the Palestinian population reside. Now, I think what we're talking about or everything we have spoken about, and I'd like to mention just in passing a couple of other issues. For example, the intense use of lethal force following October 7th, again by members of the Israeli security forces, but also by Israeli settlers. Again, a policy of revenge exerted throughout the West Bank, as well as in Gaza. Additional kind of processes that involve a complete destruction, a complete violation of the Palestinian olive harvest, the fact that throughout the West Bank, Palestinians have been prevented in a very deliberate and way from harvesting their olives as, under the guise of a counter-terror operation by settlers and by the army. All of those factors that we've been documenting are clear, they're not, none of them are new policies, but they've been, as I said, turbocharged post October 7th. And in a sense, the defining, the common feature of all of this reality that we're describing is the Israeli apartheid regime. The notion that we Israelis are entitled to the superior position, the notion of Jewish supremacy that is being as the the central organizing feature of this regime that operates throughout our region, between the river and the sea. This has been identified by B'Tselem a few years ago as the kind of the most central aspect of, or the most central project of the Israeli regime, the takeover of land, the application through a whole range of policies and practices and laws of this principle of Jewish supremacy has simply been elevated in recent months and is allowed to impact the reality on the ground for Palestinians in ways that we have never seen before, and things have been amply documented. Now, our perspective is would have probably required some descriptions, explanations over the last few years since B'Tselem issued our position paper demonstrating the Israeli apartheid regime and analyzing its ramifications and the need to end it, the need to move towards a future where all human beings who live between the river and the sea will have the same access to rights, to freedom, to equality, to dignity. But these days, there is no need to do any more convincing, because this principle of Jewish supremacy has been enshrined by our government. This current government, as I said earlier, has not completely strayed from past governmental policies, right? I think it's very important to remember that the takeover of Palestinian land, the principle of separation, of fragmentation, of fragmenting Palestinian space, of ensuring Jewish supremacy throughout the entire area between the river and the sea has been the policy and has been enacted by successive long-term Israeli governments. But this current government is saying things extremely and honestly, and in its founding document, its basic principles, has stated that between the river and the sea, there is, I'm paraphrasing, that the entire area will never see any form of sovereignty other than Jewish sovereignty. This is the situation we're relating to at the moment. As Israelis living in Israeli society, this is a very difficult and very challenging moment for us. It's both heartbreaking and enraging to see what my society is doing, the society that I live in, but I think it's our obligation to speak out against this reality. And B'Tselem has called for the international community to take action to end it. There really is a very clear, I think now obvious fact, which is that the current Israeli regime isn't going to do any of this by its own volition. We know that this is the long-term intentions of the people who are leading this country now and in the past. And I think it's important to remember that there is a specific political framework at the moment, but even if this framework changes, the principle of Jewish supremacy, unfortunately, will remain as the guiding principle. And therefore, it is up to the international community to take action in order to change this reality, in order to guarantee a future of freedom, of security, of rights to all human beings. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you, and I look forward to listening to the rest of this conference. Thank you.
Grazie a Sarit Michaeli per le sue parole e grazie soprattutto anche per il lavoro che fa tutti i giorni, che fa B'Tselem tutti i giorni nella difesa dei diritti umani nei territori occupati palestinesi. Grazie. Ora passiamo la parola al professor Ilan Pappé, docente dell'Università di Exeter, uno dei maggiori storici del Medio Oriente e della Palestina in particolare, e uno dei rappresentanti della cosiddetta nuova storiografia israeliana.
Good evening, buonasera. It's a great honor to share this podium with such distinguished speakers. It's also a tough act to follow each one of them. I want to thank the President of the Council for inviting us. I don't take it for granted, not in Italy, not in any Western European country. Thank you all for staying that long with us in this rather cold but very important hall. I don't know how the Medici survived in the winter. I would not live here even if you pay me $1 million for a month. Okay. Okay. Why is Israel so brutal? And we heard from everyone about the Israeli brutality. Why is it so brutal, particularly since the 7th of October? Why is it always more brutal with every year than it is before? It is more brutal, and that's something which is difficult to see because it's with every brutality you think that you are in a dark period with no hope. It is so brutal because it's coming to an end. That's why it's brutal. Every regime that is based on injustice, on colonization, on oppression, on ethnic cleansing, cannot survive forever. A regime that takes over a land from a native people, expels half of them, and yet these people are still there and are still fighting, are still resisting, in a world that changes, in a world that is much more loyal maybe than before to principles of equality, of freedom, of liberation, even if the governments of that world are not always adhering to these principles, the societies are fighting for that, not only in Palestine, but in many other places. So in this moment of darkness, we should also talk about the dawn after the night. We don't have the luxury as Palestinians and as people who support Palestine to drag ourselves into despair in this very cruel moment, because there are, and I'm saying this not as an activist, and I'm not saying it as a wishful thinking. I say it as a scholar who examines the situation in Israel and Palestine for more than 40 years. There are clear indications that Zionism as an idea, Zionism as a project, Zionism as an ideology, Zionism as an infrastructure for a state is not working. It's not working economically, it's not working politically, it's not working morally. And if anything positive can come out from the horrific chapter, and everyone here described, and I don't want to repeat it, that we are going through and we're living through, are the indications from within Israel, first of all, and the indication in the world, an indication in the region, that what we are seeing is the beginning of the end of the Zionist project, and this is good news, not bad news. However, a beginning of an end in history is, first of all, not a short period. It's a long period. And as we can see from what's going on today in historical Palestine, it is also a very dangerous period, because the project that is not working is fighting for its life, is using, without any inhibitions, every possible method that it has to try and force itself on the reality, on people, on the region, and on the world. And this always ends up with more killings, with more ethnic cleansing, with more destruction. So the fact that we are watching this collapse, and I will talk in a minute of these indications for that collapse, the fact that we are watching that collapse should also alert us to the fact that, unfortunately, we are in the near future, into more violence, more ruthless policies by the State of Israel towards the Palestinians. So I don't want to create this impression that I think that from tomorrow we are going to witness the unfolding of a new reality. But we have to keep in mind that what we are watching is not something that will end in a year and a half. It is the beginning of a decade of a fundamental change in the history of historical Palestine. The first indication, which was there before the 7th of October, and in many ways created the impression that something changed in this respect because of the 7th of October, is the internal explosion of the Israeli society from within, the lack of social cohesion in Israel. This is not your usual fragmentation that you have in societies between people, between different socioeconomic, classes or people even between different ethnic or cultural or religious background. No, this is something far more severe. This is the total disintegration of the idea that Judaism can be nationalism. It cannot. Judaism is not a basis for creating a nation state. This has nothing to do with the Palestinians. Even if the Jews from all over the world would have tried to solve anti-Semitism by going to an empty island that nobody lived in and wouldn't have expelled anyone, it would not have worked. This is, I'm not saying it because I knew it beforehand or I predicted it. I'm saying it as an Israeli Jew who's lived there for more than 69 years now, 70 years. It doesn't work. We don't have anything in common apart from our hatred of the Palestinians and our persuasion that we are constantly under existential danger. And that should unite us because so many people want to kill us, whether these are the Palestinians, the Arabs, the Muslims, the anti-Semites. You don't build in the 21st century a normal society on the basis that we are all here together because everybody hates us. It doesn't work. It worked for a while. It worked for a while. And the reason that it worked for a while was that the labor Zionist movement that created Zionism produced an impression that you can kind of reconcile between the idea of Zionism, which is this idea of a racist nationalism that is based on defining who is a Zionist by saying anyone who is not an Arab inside Palestine, and universal values such as liberalism, socialism, doesn't matter what. I think that what the 7th of October has shown us, and some of us have written about it before, that all these ideas that you can be a liberal Zionist, you can be a progressive occupier, you can be a socialist ethnic cleanser, or you can be a democratic genocider. All these oxymorons, as we call them, all these oxymorons, after the 7th of October, have collapsed. This is why those who call themselves the left in Israel are so angry with you. They're really angry with you, those who call themselves the left in Israel. And they write daily in Haaretz about it. They're angry with you that you are not accepting their demand to condemn the Hamas, period. That you are giving a context, that you are calling for a free Palestine from the river to the sea, not because of what happened on the 7th of October, not despite the 7th of October. I think all this is part of this inability to create, in the middle of the Arab world, a nation state based on Judaism that pretends also to be loyal to universal values such as liberalism or socialism. It doesn't matter which kind of universal values. The fact is, and that's why Zionism was doomed to fail, that all these ideas, whether they work or not, that Jews are a nation and not a religion, that you can be a racist and a universalist at the same time, they all don't work because of the reality on the ground. The only way of sustaining a Jewish state, and it doesn't matter whether it's a Jewish state in the pre-1967 borders or a Jewish state all over Palestine. The only way of sustaining a Jewish Zionist state is by constantly oppressing the Palestinians. There is no other way of doing it. And one of the reasons that the so-called peace process that the Americans initiated after 1967 has failed is because it was based on this idea that somehow the oppression of the Palestinians, the colonization of the Palestinians, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, the massacres of the Palestinians, do not negate the idea of a democratic Jewish state. People in Italy believed in it. People in the West believed in it. People believe that it's only a matter of persuading the Palestinians to agree to peace with Israel, and then you will see the real Israel, the one that respects universal values and so on. It is not possible, because the only solution for what goes on in Israel and Palestine has to be based on equality. And you cannot have an equality under a two-state solution. You cannot have an equality as long as Israel is a Jewish nation state. This is not equality. This is an imposition of a colonialist structure from the late 19th century on the 21st century. So one indication, which is very important, the idea of Zionism is not working, not for secular Jews in their relationship with religious Jews, not for settlers with those who live in Tel Aviv, and not for anyone who watches from the outside and asks what will make the Israelis to stop their oppression of the Palestinians. If you look at all of that together, the basic idea of Israel as a Jewish nation state is failing and collapsing. The second indication, which is very important, I think, is the change in international perception of Israel. Yes, it is true that governments in the West have not yet followed their societies when it comes to Palestine. But I think that there are the beginning of indications. Dr. Barghouti talked about the BDS. I think there are indications that we are moving from the B and D, the boycott and the divestment, to the S, to the sanctions. The boycott and divestment are not enough. We need the sanctions. We need the governments to take action, not only the societies. And the moment, and this will happen, I think the move to the ICJ, the move among some governments now to boycott some parts of the Israeli military aid, all of these are processes that would mature later on, because, and unfortunately, the ruthless Israeli behavior on the ground will help it. Not that I wanted to do that, but it will help to convince governments that eventually that cannot be satisfied with verbal condemnation, but will have to act. And with sanctions from the outside and the collapse of the Israeli Jewish society from the inside, you have two powerful processes that would create or will contribute to the end of the Zionist project in Palestine. To this, you can add the change among the Jewish communities in the world. You may not feel it in Italy, but in the United States, the young Jewish generation does not perceive the reality as the older generation. They don't consider Israel to be an insurance state should something happen to the Jews. Israel is the less safe place for Jews in the world. The less safe. And young Americans, Jews understand it, and that's why so many of them are marching in the solidarity movement with other young Americans. And many of them in the future would be the senators of the future, the House of Representatives of the future, maybe even the presidents of the future. We should not lose hope that the current political elite, in its attitude not only to Palestine, to many other issues that are dear to our heart, would always be there. We should hope that a younger generation with a different moral perceptions, not only on Palestine, but on other issues, one day would take the lead in politics. And whenever this lead will represent a moral view, a universal view, an anti-racist view, an anti-colonialist view, an ecological view, a feminist view, a view that respects human and civil rights, if these are the politicians of the future, when it will come to Palestine and Israel, we can easily predict what would be their position. They would give their total support to the freedom and the liberation of Palestine. There are, I don't want to go too deeply to other indications, but the Israeli economy is undergoing a crisis from which it can only be saved by the United States. I don't think people realize it, how deep the economic crisis in Israel is. And if you add to this the total collapse of the army and the government, not only on the 7th of October, but after the 7th of October, there is total lack of confidence of the people themselves, in their governments, in their army. Imagine what would have happened if Hezbollah would have coordinated with the Hamas the attack on the 7th of October, even in military terms, the way that Israel was unable properly to defend itself. All these are indications, and there are many others I don't have time to go to, that we are beginning to see the end of Israel as a Jewish state as we know it. However, not only is it a dangerous moment, it is a process which I want to stress this point. I'm not talking here out of wishful thinking or because Ruba gave me a very good pill against my headache. I'm talking here as a scholar, really, as someone who analyzes it very coolly, very professionally. There is no future for Israel as a Jewish state. There really isn't. And I'm not even sure that I'm saying it only happily. I'm an Israeli Jew. I feel sorry for those people in my own people who believe that they will be building something better, maybe a safe haven for Jews. But I think it's time to admit it's not working. But we are not just observers. We are not just onlookers. If we are just standing aloof and don't do anything, then this process can lead to a vacuum. And vacuum that is not filled creates chaos. And as we know from the stories of Syria, Iraq, Libya, Lebanon, the Yemen, when you have a political void because a state disintegrates, it can go on for very long if there is no constructive, positive body, movement to fill it. So the Palestinian, and it's a high ask from the Palestinians. It's a high ask for the Palestinians at this moment that they're trying to survive. But if they are not going to come up with a truly representative body that includes all the Palestinian factions, the Hamas, the Islamic Jihad, everyone, I think it should include also the Palestinians in Israel, the 48 Arabs. If the Palestinians would not come up with an organization that includes all the Palestinians, wherever they are, with a clear vision for the future, recognizing that the two-state solution has been dead now for 20 years, we were just not invited to the funeral, that this, and give us a vision for a liberated Palestine from the river to the sea, and tell me, as a Jew, how do you see my place in the future? Because I think the Israeli Jews would have to recognize that their future in a liberated Palestine is not through the definition of a national group. Because unless there is a way of defining Jewish nationalism not as Zionism, a future Palestinian, a future democratic state for all cannot include a group that subscribes to Zionist ideology, which totally negates the Palestinians. But there are other ways. There are other ways to define collectives: cultural, ethno-cultural, ethnic, and so on. So I think it's very important now to get into this discussion. How do we see the Jewish collective in a decolonized democratic state? Finally, I would end by saying, and this is, to me, is very important, and I think we should discuss these issues now and talk openly about not only the end of Zionism, but call for the end of Zionism as activists, not just for BDS. Let's call for the end of Zionism. This is a positive call for humanity, for equality. But I think we should also be aware that any attempt to build a different future in Palestine based only on examples that come from Europe is doomed to fail. If we think that the only possible political structure that can replace the apartheid state of Israel today is another Westphalian nation state, a European nation state, then we are going to repeat the mistakes of the past. The Mashreq, the Eastern Mediterranean, where Palestine is an area that knew exactly how to coexist, how communities with different religious identity, different ethnic identity, knew how to share a place, how to coexist, how to live with one another. Political systems that do not recognize the mosaic of communities in the Mashreq, political solutions that do not recognize the legacies of the past, the civilization of the past, that try to inject European ideas into an area that has a very glorified history and legacy and heritage is not going to work. So you cannot separate the future of Palestine from the future of Syria, of Lebanon, of Jordan. This is something that the people there themselves would have to find out. It's time from Europe to take, and the West, to take a more humble position and not tell people in the Mashreq and not tell people in the Mashreq what they should do, how their political system should look like, but ask them, what do you need from us to make the place where you live better for us and for you? So it's time, I think, to connect the struggle for justice in the whole of the Mashreq with the struggle for justice in Palestine, and ask the global South, the Muslim world, the Arab world, not to take a back seat, but to take a front seat, and let's bring to an end the Pax Americana, our belief in Western Europe or American ability to move us forward to a better solution. They have tried, they have failed, they have been unfair, they have not the interest of the people there in their heart. It's time for others to take the role as regional mediators, as international mediators, and hopefully together make sure that the inevitable collapse of the Zionist project would be replaced by a political structure of equality for all that would inspire the whole of the Arab world to begin a new chapter of hope and prosperity. Thank you.
Allora, siamo in chiusura. Io credo che dobbiamo ringraziare i nostri ospiti. Ruba Salih, Sarit Michaeli, Ilan Pappé, Francesca Albanese, Mustafa Barghouti, Manfredi lo Sauro, che ci ha aiutato in questa conduzione. Usciamo arricchiti. Prima di concludere, io poi vorrei lasciare la parola ancora a Francesca Albanese per provare a dare una direzione alla giornata di oggi. Voglio però ringraziare il personale che è qui, del cerimoniale, dell'ufficio della direzione, e i nostri tecnici, Giuseppe con la multimedia service, che hanno fatto un miracolo. Adesso si può dire è andato tutto bene, quindi grazie. Francesca, io ti lascio la parola per poterci Ma non so come, però intanto grazie ancora e grazie a voi che siete stati davvero qui con noi oggi.
E scusandomi con i relatori, questa volta parlerò in italiano perché vorrei veramente fare il punto, di questa fantastica conferenza che ha portato così tanti stimoli. Per me è stato bellissimo sentire Ruba parlare, perché troppo poco e troppo di rado accade che si dia spazio ai palestinesi, alle voci dei palestinesi, e c'è un'intera anzi ci sono almeno 3 generazioni di palestinesi in Italia, ma soprattutto i giovani che sono palestinesi e italiani hanno tutta la ricchezza per fare anche da ponte con quel mondo che così poco conosciamo, e quindi è stato veramente bello averti ed ascoltarti, Ruba. E chiaramente è stato molto, molto potente sentire anche gli altri relatori, Mustafa Barghouti e Ilan Pappé. Quindi vorrei concludere con alcune riflessioni su ciò che è stato detto. È chiaro, emerge che la situazione dinanzi alla quale ci si trova è un momento di grande cambiamento. Ilan in un altro incontro ha detto it's a watershed moment, è veramente come una valanga, un'alluvione, e non si sa, cioè si sa che trasporterà via tanto. Lo status quo, quello che c'era fino al 7 ottobre è finito. Ed è interessante vedere la reazione dei politici, soprattutto occidentali. La loro paura di perdere il controllo li spinge adesso a pensare ai 2 stati. Ma non siete riusciti a farlo funzionare in 30 anni. E francamente, io da giurista e da persona esterna sono abbastanza agnostica su quale sia la forma di Stato necessaria, uno Stato, 2 Stati. Questo non compete, la decisione su questo non ci compete. Noi dobbiamo soltanto assicurarci che i palestinesi, così come gli israeliani, abbiano il diritto all'autodeterminazione, che diventi una realtà per loro e non di un popolo a scapito di un altro. E se non si riesce a realizzare uno Stato di Palestina indipendente, è bene che ci sia piena cittadinanza di tutte e tutti, perché questo è il diritto all'autodeterminazione ed è anche diritto delle minoranze. Quindi 2 stati o uno Stato, quale che sia la via cui palestinesi e israeliani decideranno di addivenire, è fondamentale che gli stati occidentali soprattutto lavorino per creare le condizioni perché questo avvenga, e non cercando di imporre quello che loro pensano sia la soluzione. L'altro elemento è che il colonialismo di insediamento, che è una parola che è ricorsa molto spesso in questa tavola di lavoro, è riassumibile, come Ilan ha detto, è il prendere la terra ai nativi. Era così 500 anni fa ed è così ancora oggi. La stranezza è che questo sistema è veramente anacronistico, però c'è ancora, bisogna riconoscerlo, bisogna chiamarlo come tale. E decolonizzare non significa cacciare via gli israeliani, non significa togliergli i diritti, ma significa chiedergli di smettere di privare un altro popolo dei propri diritti in nome del suprematismo israeliano ebraico. E siccome il colonialismo di insediamento è genocida per sua natura, quindi quello a cui assistiamo adesso è il completamento di un disegno che è inevitabile. Il colonialismo di insediamento mira all'eliminazione o attraverso la pulizia etnica o attraverso la segregazione o quando ci sono forme di violenza, insurrezione, anche di genocidio. E questo ce lo insegnano 500, ancora una volta, 500 anni di colonialismo europeo in giro per il mondo. Come ci diceva, è stato molto bello anche ascoltare, molto doloroso ascoltare Sarit. Il presente è doloroso per palestinesi e israeliani, non sta a noi fare gerarchie ma è molto importante riuscire a capire in modo compassionevole il dolore e il trauma di ognuno e agire con giudizio, agire con compassione, senza, appunto, non è una partita di calcio in cui si sta da una parte o dall'altra, questo bisogna spiegarlo sia ai politici che ai giornalisti italiani. E quindi bisogna insistere per avere un dibattito informato ed onesto sulla questione israelo-palestinese. E io sono veramente grata non sono tanti, ai pochi giuristi ma buoni che si stanno spendendo tanto, e sono molto felice di avere qui la professoressa Michaela Frulli, perché sta scrivendo tanto e contribuendo al dibattito. È difficile, ma bisogna continuare a chiedere spazi in televisione, sui giornali, e per questo servite voi, tutti e tutte, cittadini e le cittadine. E ricordiamoci che l'apartheid in Sudafrica non è stato smantellato, perché ad un certo punto il governo bianco sudafricano ha perso interesse a mantenere un regime di oppressione e segregazione. C'è stata tanta pressione all'interno, ma c'è stata soprattutto tanta pressione dall'esterno. E quando oggi si parla di BDS, che sembra un anatema, questo è il diritto internazionale, forme di boicottaggio, di sanzione e fine degli investimenti in attività illegali, è quello che deriva dalla Carta delle Nazioni Unite quando ci sono degli illeciti internazionali. Quindi, armati di buona volontà, vediamo che cosa ognuno di noi può fare per cambiare questa situazione, perché si tratta di rinunciare ad un po' della propria serenità, del proprio benessere, del proprio equilibrio, per evitare che un altro popolo debba rinunciare a tutto. E vi ringrazio. Grazie Manfredi.